My name is Tammy Hendricks. I am actually an alumnus of Toro, California. After I graduated from there, I went to Children's Hospital Los Angeles, which is an allopathic residency program in LA. And then after my residency, I came back to Toro, California, which is where I'm teaching. So I have been teaching faculty at Toro since 2009. I'm now the Assistant Dean of Clinical Integration. I'm the chair of the Pediatric Department. I'm the medical director of our school-based clinic. I wear a number of hats there. But one of the things that I do frequently is I counsel our students, especially those students who are interested in pediatrics. And so there's quite a bit of advice that I would love to pass along to you guys. And then I'd really like for the bulk of this session to be more of a Q&A style session. So if you have any questions, please ask the moderator so that they can ask, so that I'll actually be able to hear it. And I want to thank ACOP, and especially the students of ACOP, for being flexible enough to allow me to give this presentation. I'm so sorry that I'm not there in person, but I'm grateful that I have this other modality to be able to deliver this information. So I'm going to start with the same place that I start with almost all of our students. When the students come in to speak to me and ask about how they can be more competitive with getting into a pediatric residency, and that's by pointing them to a particular resource. I do want to say, and I'd love to know if there are any faculty or program directors in the room. I have quite a few pediatric program directors who are my friends, but if there are any in the room, I'd love for them to offer up their opinions as well, because I'm sure, as you have seen as students, sometimes people have different opinions, and I think that it's valuable for you to hear everybody's. This last residency cycle, so this last match cycle that just ended very recently, we saw that pediatrics continues to be a competitive field. It used to be that pediatrics was one of the least competitive fields, and so it was a field that you could go into and not worry too much about your board scores, not worry too much about how competitive your application looked. But in the last few cycles, we've seen that there have been more people who want to go into pediatrics than there are actually pediatric spots. And that's with both the osteopathic and the allopathic residency spots combined. Clearly, that's going to become a moot point in a couple of years once the merger is complete. But we're already seeing that there are some issues with that already. So even at our school, we had a couple of students who really wanted to go into pediatrics and unfortunately weren't able to match into pediatrics in either the osteopathic or the allopathic cycle, and ended up needing to scramble, and they ended up scrambling into family medicine because there weren't any more pediatric programs open. So I tell you that not to make you concerned, but just to have you go into this with your eyes wide open so you know exactly what you're getting into. So let's talk about how you can be successful, how you can be one of those people that gets one of those spots. So the place that I go to, I'm going to share my screen with you guys. The place that I direct students to go to is a wonderful tool that comes out every 2 years. So here I'm all the way on page 103 of this report. But it's the National Residency Match Program Director Survey. And this survey comes out every 2 years. So this is the most recent one that I'm looking at, 2016. There'll be another one coming out next year. I've been presenting this information to our students pretty much since they came back to Toro. So I've seen the last 4 versions of this. And I can say that there are some minor changes that happen year to year. And I'll talk a little bit about those. But what I like about this survey is it surveys almost all of the program directors, of the allopathic program directors. Like I said, making that distinction is going to become more of a moot point as we move more officially into the merger. But these are all the allopathic pediatric program directors answering these questions. And I'm going to use this as a guide to help show you the things that you really need to be focusing on. So this very first question is the percentage of programs that cited each factor in mean importance rating for each factor in selecting applicants to interview. So basically, what are the most important things that they look at on your application when they're choosing whether or not they're going to interview you? So we can see, not surprisingly, board scores are right up at the top. Right? We can see that the first level of the boards is the most important. The second level of the boards is also pretty high up there. Any failed attempt at one of the boards is also a factor that they're taking into account. So those are things that you need to know. We can also see that in terms of grades, the grades in your required clerkships. So those are primarily the grades from your third year core rotations. That is certainly something that they take into account. And then your class ranking and class quartile. That's another thing that they're taking into account. So those are all of the academic things. So if I had to advise a first-year student who's saying, how can I be competitive going into a pediatric residency? It's really, how can you be competitive going into any residency? And that is, try to study really hard, try to keep your grades up, try to make sure you're as prepared as you possibly can be for those board exams. I'm going to come back to the boards because I know the burning question for osteopathic medical students is always, do I have to take the USMLE? And if I do, what score should I get? So we'll come back to that in a minute. The next thing I want to point out are the letters of recommendation in the specialty. So I point this out because some students feel like they need to get a letter of recommendation from every single rotation that they're on, and that certainly isn't the case at all. Ideally, you're going to have about 4 letters of recommendation, and you want them to be strong letters of recommendation. You don't want them to be fairly generic, just saying that you showed up and that you showed improvement. So you want really strong letters of recommendation. The strongest letters of recommendation you can get are letters of recommendation from pediatricians that are associated with pediatric residency programs. Where do you get those letters? You get those letters when you're doing your sub-Is or your audition rotations at different residency programs. So having an early sub-I or an early audition rotation, and by early I mean July, August, maybe even September, and getting a really strong letter from one of those, that's going to be one of your most important letters. Letter from, if your school has a chair of the pediatric department or a chair of the pediatric division, that's another excellent letter for you to get. So the most important letters are letters in pediatrics. The strongest pediatric letters are from people in pediatric residency programs. The next thing we'll see is the dean's letter. The dean's letter is also very, very important. If your school offers you the opportunity to take part in shaping your dean's letter, then you absolutely should. Find out who writes your dean's letter. It's not always the dean of your college. In our school, it's actually our associate dean of academic affairs writes our dean's letter. He's absolutely fabulous. And I encourage all of our students to go and meet with him regularly, because the better he knows you, the more personal of a letter he's able to write. So that goes for any college of osteopathic medicine. The better that person who's composing that letter for you knows you, the more they're able to structure the letter so that it really represents you. And then the next thing that we get to is personal statement. And this has been something that has changed over the last few years. We've seen personal statement really move up in the ranking. So your personal statement is important. It's not something you need to lose sleep over at all, but it is something that you need to be able to write, and write well. I encourage students to write their personal statement before they look at any examples of personal statements, because the last thing you want is for your personal statement to come across as being generic. You don't want to accidentally steal somebody else's flow of their personal statement or the way they write their personal statement. You want it to be unique, and you want it to talk about you. Things that you should not include in your personal statement include statements like, I've always loved children. And that's a fine statement to have in your personal statement for pediatrics, but don't start with that, right? The program directors are reading through thousands of personal statements. So yours needs to be unique. It needs to stand out. Your first few sentences need to really capture your reader. So have it be something that is fairly dramatic, right? I encourage students to start with a patient story. Think of a fantastic patient story, something that was really meaningful to you, and then tell that patient's story in your personal statement. Your personal statement should not rehash why you wanted to be a doctor, right? That was your personal statement for entry into medical school. At this point, you are going to be a doctor, right? You're getting closer and closer to graduating. We don't need to know why you want to be a doctor. We know that you're here for the right reasons. What we want to know is, why do you want to go into pediatrics? Why is pediatrics the perfect specialty for you? And then, why are you perfect for pediatrics? What do you bring to the field of pediatrics? What have been some of your experiences, your backgrounds, your leadership skills, all of those things as to why you're going into pediatrics? Ideally, you're going to have somebody from your school read your personal statement so that they can help edit it for you, help make sure that it is grammatically correct, right? There are a few program directors who won't even look at a personal statement if there's spelling errors or grammatical errors. So make sure that those simple things have been corrected early on. But the big thing is make sure that it's unique to you, right? Have something that really captures the reader within those first few lines and make sure that you really come across in your personal statement. As we move down, we can see that the next most important thing are your grades in pediatrics. So how have you done on your pediatric rotations? If you've been able to get honors in pediatric rotations, that's fabulous. If your grades have been good in pediatric rotations, that is also good. Next is evidence of professionalism and ethics, perceived commitment to specialty, personal prior knowledge of the applicant. So give me a second, I'm gonna see if I can annotate this. So I'm gonna draw in yellow. Nope, I don't wanna draw in red. I'm gonna draw in yellow. So if I look at, I'm sorry, oh, look at how straight I can draw that. It's impressive for 4 o'clock in the morning. So evidence of professionalism and ethics, perceived commitment to the specialty, personal prior knowledge of the applicant. It's getting a little bit messy. Audition or elective rotation within your department, perceived interest in the program. So we look at all of those, right? So these are all, you know, within those top 15 things that program directors are using to choose whether they're going to interview an applicant or not. I would argue that all of those things come from doing an audition rotation or a sub-I at that particular residency program. I think that sub-Is and audition rotations are one of the most important things that you can do. There are some medical schools that only allow their students to get away for one elective rotation during their 4th year, and so many medical students are only able to do one sub-I or one audition rotation. So if you're only able to do one, that is absolutely fine. If you're able to do more, then try to do more. I think that's one of the best ways that you can really squeak your foot in the door, especially if all of this stuff, if your board scores, if your grades, if that stuff isn't so hot for you, this is a great way to get your foot in the door of a program that would otherwise look at your application and put your application into one of the more negative piles. So this way they actually get to know who you are, they get to see how hard of a worker you are, they get to see how well you work with a team. A quick note about audition rotations and sub-Is as well is I've heard students say, well, I don't want to do a sub-I at this place because it's going to reflect poorly upon me. They're going to see how little I know. And sub-Is, audition rotations in general, it is so much not what you know, but how you behave, right? What program directors want, what any attending wants, is somebody who is enthusiastic, somebody who's trying hard, somebody who is showing up early, who's a helpful member of the team, not somebody who knows everything. I do want to see that somebody can learn, that they're actually, I'm not having to repeat the same facts over and over again. But if they didn't know something the first time that we talked about it, the next time we talk about it, they should definitely show me that they've learned it, right? So don't be afraid to go into a sub-I and not know all of the information. Don't be afraid to do a NICU rotation, something that is entirely different, because you're going to learn there, right? You have that steep learning curve, and part of what you're showing them is how well you can surmount that steep learning curve, how good of an attitude you can have, how helpful of a team member you are. All of those things are so much more important. I strongly believe that the reason that I ended up getting in, that I ended up matching at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, is because of the sub-I that I did there. So let me clear that out. And let's keep going down. Leadership qualities. So that's great if you are you know, if you are actively involved in ACOP or in your pediatric club chapter at your school, if you've had other leadership experience, that's certainly something that they're looking at. Consistency of grades, so have your grades really fluctuated? If your grades were poor initially and your grades are getting better, that's always a good sign. Same with the boards. If you didn't do so hot on the first level or first step, and then you showed great improvement, that is a great sign, right? It shows that you're able to do better. And then these are some of the other things that they're looking at that I won't talk about too much unless anybody has specific questions about them. I'm going to go through, I think there's 3 more pages that I want to go through, and then we'll open it up to questions. So now I'm going to scroll on to the second question. And this second question, it looks, when you're just looking at it, like it's exactly the same as the last question. But this question is, oops, I need to do that. It hides the title for me. This question is the percentage of programs citing each factor in mean importance rating for each factor in ranking applicants. So this means now you have interviewed at the program. Who do they select to rank? Who do they put on their rank list? And I'm going to annotate again to show my point. This thicker. Okay, perfect. So interactions with faculty during the interview. Interpersonal skills, interactions with house staff during the interview, feedback from current residents, evidence of professionalism and ethics, perceived commitment to the specialty, perceived interest in the program. All right, so I'm going to do those. So we see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of those top few, those top 15 or so, 7 of them have to do with the interview itself. So with this, I'm emphasizing to you how important the interview is. Once you get offered an interview at a program, you're essentially a clean slate. And now they're comparing how you do on your interview with how all of the other interviewees do. So I strongly, strongly, strongly encourage, and maybe that's something that ACOP can offer at some point as well, that you do mock interviews, that you actually sit down and practice doing an interview. Get all dressed up in your suit, practice an interview with somebody. If you can, record yourself, video record yourself, so that you can pick up the different things that you might do, like, oh, that's a little bit awkward the way that I paused with that question, or I never realized I touched my face so much when I got nervous, all of those type of things. So doing a mock interview is something that I strongly encourage you to do, because your interviewing skills, your ability to interview well, that's really what's going to help seal the deal once you get your foot in the door and once you get interviewed by programs. We can see that the other important things on here are similar to before, right? With the board scores, your letters of recommendation in the specialty, the dean's letter. We can see that personal statement has kind of dropped down off of this list. That's because much more important than your personal statement is your interview, is how you were actually in person. Yeah. Personal prior knowledge of the applicant. And I want to say this too about even before you get interviewed. If you know people who know people in a pediatric residency program and it's a program that you're interested in, ask them to put in a good word for you. As you move on in your medical career, it is so much about who you know and having people be able to vouch for you. So that's part of what our letters of recommendation do. But if you can have somebody who has a personal contact in a program talk about you as well, that's going to hold you in good stead. Okay. So I am now going to move on. And like I said, we can always discuss this stuff again later if anybody has questions about it. I'm moving on to this area, and I'm not going to go over this part too much, but I do want you just to take a look at kind of how these graphs look. So this is the percentage of programs that use the USMLE Step 1. So we can see the majority of them, right? This is 98% use USMLE Step 1, either a pass only or specific target score. Only 1% doesn't use it. Would you consider applicants who fail the exam on the first attempt? Most would consider, right, either often or seldom. Moving on to Step 2, we can see that it's similar. You know, here we have 91% use Step 2, 50% have a target score that they want people to reach. And then would you consider people who fail on the first attempt? Once again, the vast majority of programs would, but it seems that failing Step 2 is something that's seen as a little bit more serious. There's a higher percentage of programs that would never consider an applicant if they failed Step 2. And then this is really the part that I want you guys to look at, as well as what's on the next slide when we talk about the COMLEX, is what are the cutoff scores? So these are just averages, right? And there are always people, we have people every single year who fail COMLEX, who never take the USMLE, who end up matching at amazing pediatric residency programs. And I think almost all of that has to do with how well they did in their sub-I or in their audition rotation, and then subsequently how well they did on their interview. So a strong sub-I or audition rotation, a really strong interview, it can certainly make up for a number of other deficits that might be there in your application. When we look at these cutoff scores, so these are scores below which programs generally do not grant interviews. And we can see for Step 1, that lowest cutoff score is 200, with the average being just below 210. Right? For Step 2, really similar, 200, 210. So ideally, you're trying to score higher than that, higher than 210. Then we look at this next one, which shows scores above which programs almost always grant interviews. And these scores are kind of right at 220, between 220 and 230. And so I would say if you're going to aim for a score, which we all try to score as high as we possibly can, try to get at least 220. Now that doesn't mean if you don't have 220 that you need to throw your application in the trash and decide that pediatrics is not the right specialty for you. But it does mean that, you know, maybe you're going to have to beef up some other parts of your application. So now we move in to, so that's Step 2 CS and Step 3 scores. Now we move into the COMLEX. And I want you to just note how different these graphs look compared to the other one. So here, when they're saying if you use COMLEX level 1, from 1% for USMLE Step 1, it jumps all the way up to 12%, that programs will not use those scores at all. If we look at level 2, this jumps up to 18%. Now, as an osteopathic medical educator, as somebody, I'm actually the chair of the COMAT, the Pediatric COMAT for the NBOME, so I'm heavily involved in the NBOME as well. I would love to tell you that you only need to take the NBOME. However, as I said, we are seeing that pediatrics is a competitive field, and that for both allopathic and osteopathic programs, there aren't enough pediatric spots to be able to meet the needs of all of the people who are applying and interested in pediatrics. So my recommendation is that you do take a USMLE, right? When I was a student, I chose osteopathic medical education, osteopathic medical school, because I wanted to be a DO. I did not want to be an MD at all, and I wanted to assert my osteopathic distinctiveness. So when I sat to take level 1, I purposely did not take Step 1, the USMLE Step 1, because my board exam was a nationally certifying board exam, and it should be accepted around the country, across the country. And I still believe that it really should be accepted. And we are seeing that it's accepted in places. But if you want to be the most competitive applicant you can possibly be, if you're competing with all the other people who are taking the USMLE, then I think that you should strongly consider taking a USMLE. And you'll note that I'm saying a USMLE, I'm not saying which USMLE. So in my instance, and this was a few years ago now, right? I graduated from medical school in 2006. So I did not take Step 1, and to be quite honest, I am not convinced I'd be able to pass Step 1. I really learned medicine so much more during my clinical years than I had in my preclinical years. For when it came time for me to take level 2, I decided to take the USMLE Step 2 as well. So you can take the USMLE steps in whichever order you want. You could take Step 3 right now. You could take them in any order. And you can choose to just take one of them. So I only took the USMLE Step 2. For COMLEX Level 1 and for USMLE Step 1. I find those two exams to be very different exams. They have a different focus. Their question styles are certainly different. The USMLE tends to be much more focused in things like biochemistry and genetics. So if you have a very strong basic science background, then fantastic. If you don't have a very strong basic science background, or you otherwise have challenges with taking standardized board exams, then put your emphasis on COMLEX, right? It's always more important that you do better on COMLEX because that's our nationally board certifying exam. But if you want to do what I've done, and we have now had numbers of students who have done what I've done, who have only taken USMLE Step 2, the Step 2 and Level 2 exams are much more even, right? They're really focusing on the clinical medicine. And so it's much easier to study for both of those two exams at the same time. And I think it's much easier, it was much easier for me to do well on Step 2 because of that. And so I was able to get a fairly decent Step 2 score, which I think really helped. I applied to pediatric residency programs exclusively in California, which is a particularly competitive place. And throughout my application cycle, I had a couple program directors thank me for taking a USMLE. Now, like I said, that was a number of years ago. I would love to think that times have changed. I would love to think that with the merger, more programs are going to accept the COMLEX, but we're not seeing that quite yet. So that's my little spiel on the boards. Now, as we scroll down even more, we're just going to get to this last page. And this last page are programs interview activities. So this is on average. How many spots, how many positions in the match does the average program have? And that's 14. On average, how many applications does each program receive for those 14 spots? 1,200, right? So this is where it is so important to make your personal statement unique and stand out. Make sure your letters of recommendation are particularly strong. You need to stand out in a very, very deep pool of people who are applying. How many people do they grant interviews to? 230. So you can see, just as what we saw with the questions above, once you get granted an interview, now your chances of getting into one of those two spots are much greater, right? I mean, it's still a pretty wide margin, but it's significantly better to drop down from 1,200 all the way down to 200. All right. And then, yeah, I think that that's about it. So I am going to stop my screen share. And perfect, we're about halfway through our talk. And so at this point, I want to open it up to question and answer session. What questions do you guys have for me? And how can I help?
All right, Dr. Hendricks, the first question is, with the limited number of AOA programs, your question was, what should DO students consider? Strategy towards applying with we still have the two separate matches at this point.
It is complicated, and that is one of the reasons, one of the silver linings with the merger is that will go away, is having those two separate matches. But it's really hard because if you love an allopathic pediatric residency program, so the way that the match works, which I'm sure most of you are very familiar with, but you can apply to osteopathic pediatric residency programs or allopathic pediatric residency programs. The osteopathic match happens first. So if you submit a rank list in the osteopathic match and you match into one of those programs, you get pulled out of the allopathic match. So let's say you interview at 2 osteopathic programs and 2 allopathic programs. And one of those allopathic programs is your first choice, and the 2 osteopathic programs are maybe your second and third choice. If you choose to participate in the osteopathic match, then you lose the opportunity to even try to match at your first choice, right? Because if you match at one of those two places, you get pulled out of the allopathic match. So it's very challenging. It constantly feels like you're having to almost bargain with your future, right? You're doing a betting game with your future, trying to say, well, you know, I'd rather wait and see how I do it in this allopathic residency program. And so that is certainly a conversation that I think needs to be had individually, talking to somebody about what their experiences have been, which programs they're interested in, would they, and the big thing that I tell students when it comes time to putting in your rank list is never, ever rank a program that you wouldn't even want to scramble into, right? Sometimes you start to feel desperate and you're like, well, gosh, I should just rank this program because they interviewed me, and because I don't want to not rank all of the programs that interviewed me. But sometimes you go and interview at a program, and when you're interviewing at a program, they're not only interviewing you, but you're interviewing the program, right? You're really seeing, is this program a good fit for me? And sometimes you'll go to a program and see, oh my gosh, this is terrible. Everybody seems unhappy. I don't seem like I click really well with the people here. Then don't even rank those programs at all. So that's a little bit of getting aside from the osteopathic versus allopathic. But it is, unfortunately, a little bit of a game that you need to play. And certainly something that I encourage you to talk to your academic advisors about. If you don't have any, I'll pass around my contact information, so you can certainly contact me and I'd be happy to talk to you about too. But ultimately it ends up being a personal decision that only you can make, is how much risk you want to put into the match.
Okay, the next question is there a benefit to providing 5 or 6 or just more than the recommended number of letters of recommendation, or do programs get overwhelmed by that?
I don't think that many programs will actually read more than 5 or 6 letters of recommendation. If you have 5 or 6 letters of recommendation, they're all really strong, they're all in pediatrics, I think they'll probably scan through that and see that, and so I think that would be a positive thing. But I don't think that there's a major benefit for it. I don't think that you need to really stress about making sure that that's what you get. Ideally, having at least 3 to 4, and having at least 2 of those be really strong pediatric letters.
Sorry, Dr. Hendricks, just because I just went through the process a few months ago. Most of my programs actually limited it to 3 or 4, and I believe EVAS limits it to 4 too. So you have to pick and choose for each program. I don't know if that's new or not. Okay, so the question was, with the way VSAS works, it seems to be the strategy to apply to several different electives in the same time slot. So with that, you sometimes will have to decline an elective. What are the repercussions of having to do so, and will the program look unfavorably on that?
I love it. Excellent question. So important, because certainly you do need to be somewhat strategic with your VSAS planning and getting those audition rotations. The vast majority of pediatric residency programs, I want to say almost all of them, have a separate department that is in charge of medical student rotations. Sometimes they'll even have a separate department for 4th-year rotations as opposed to 3rd-year rotations. That department is completely separate from the pediatric residency program department. And so oftentimes your program director will never know that you have put in an application to do a sub-I or an addition rotation at that site and then pulled it, right? And then decided to cancel it because you found something else. So there really aren't very many repercussions about that at all. So I encourage you to apply to multiple programs all at the same time, in the same time frames. And then, you know, as you can, try to adjust your schedule so that you get the best schedule for yourself. As long as you're not canceling things at the very last minute, right? That never shows good on anybody. But if you're doing it with plenty of advance notice, then you're absolutely fine.
So the next question is, when you're on an inpatient service on an away audition rotation, and you're working mostly with the residents, how do you take advantage of the opportunity to talk to attending physicians or the program director to try to get a letter of recommendation?
I strongly encourage you. I actually think that you are almost wasting your opportunity doing an audition rotation or a sub-I at a program if you don't meet with a program director. So while you are on your audition rotation or your sub-I, I encourage you to try to meet with the program director, schedule meetings with the program director, go and find their administrative assistant and ask when you can meet with them. And meet with them ideally twice, once halfway through your audition rotation and once at the very end of your audition rotation. And in those meetings, you're really just letting them know who you are. You're letting them know how interested you are in their program, that you're there rotating, that you absolutely love it. You can even ask, is there anything I can do to make myself a more competitive applicant? Something just to touch bases and let them put a face to your name. And then even sending a thank you letter to them. Thank you for the fantastic audition rotation. Thank you for the opportunity to rotate with your program. This is what I liked particularly about it. So once again, you're just kind of keeping your name and your information fresh in their mind. In terms of getting a good letter, sometimes that can be really hard if you are exclusively with the residents. So what you could do is, if you have a resident that you're particularly close with, is ask them if they would feel comfortable writing a letter on your behalf and having the attending co-sign it. So that way you're still getting a really strong personal letter. And then you still get that signature from a faculty member who's working in a pediatric residency program.
All right, Dr. Hendricks, correct me if I'm wrong too, okay. The question is, when you're meeting with these program directors, is it okay to ask them specifically where you would fall in their rankings? Is that something that's okay to do, or is it better to just kind of ask for feedback and not really ask that direct question and kind of play the game a little bit? Is that right? Okay.
I would probably avoid asking that question directly. They're not supposed to tell you where they rank you. You can let them know that they're your #1 choice, and you can let multiple programs know that. I think asking for feedback is a really good way to do that. I think you know, also asking how you can be more competitive, letting them know how interested in your program, how much you love them. I also want to say this. This year in particular, I had more of our students from TUCOM, who were program directors or people associated, like assistant program directors, let our students know, we're ranking you at the top, like literally told them that. And then those students ended up not matching at their programs. So unfortunately, even if a program director, or even if you hear from somebody high up in the program that they are ranking you very highly, you can't, nothing is said and done until the match is said and done. So take everything you hear with a grain of salt. So still continue to have your really good backup plans, and don't put too much stock in what is said, which is so unfortunate. And some of these programs are from, you know, top tier programs. I don't want to call them out, but some of the top tier programs in California, it's really disappointing I had a student forward on the messages that he had received, and it's pretty ridiculous that he didn't end up matching there.
Are the programs in California, do they have a specific preference for students that are from California, or is there less of a bias, specifically in the state of California and their residency programs?
Excellent question. It's not like undergrad or like some medical schools. I don't think they have a preference for people in California. I think they definitely want to see that somebody's interested in their particular program. And so if you are from somewhere else, letting them know why you have a vested interest in that particular program that's far from where you are would be important. But no, if you can even go through the different programs and look at their resident lists and look at the places where they graduated from medical school, and you'll see the vast majority of them are from all over the place.
So with some of the electives, most of them are 4-week-long rotations. Some of them are 2 weeks, or if they're offered to the student, is there a benefit to doing the 2 weeks, or is 4 weeks really the preferred length of an audition rotation?
4 weeks is definitely the preferred. It is very difficult to get to know a student. And I think as a student, it's very difficult to be able to show how awesome you are in 2 weeks. You know, every single rotation, especially if it's at a place that you haven't been before, it has that learning curve from everything like, where's the bathroom? Where do I put my lunch? Where do I park my car? All of that stuff. And so you just get better and better as your time goes on there. I think 2 weeks is a really difficult time to learn very much, and it's a difficult time to show, to really shine very much. So I encourage you to do 4 weeks as much as you can.
If you're really interested in a program but are unable to schedule an audition elective in the pediatrics program, would you recommend trying to do one in a different specialty in that same program, or is that not going to be beneficial?
It'll at least get you there. And so at least being in the same hospital or in the same area, you can still do that thing where you meet with the program director and let them know how interested you are. I certainly wouldn't encourage you to do a sub-I in a different specialty, just because sub-Is are so much work. And if it's a specialty that you're not in love with, then that's going to be kind of a waste of your time and energy. But if you're able to get into, you know, say some sort of an IM rotation, and it's something that you need to do anywhere, and it's at a same site where a pediatric residency program is, then yeah, absolutely. And I would be upfront with your attendings at that point and let them know you're really interested in peds, and ask them, is it okay if I go and join the pediatric rounds? I'm really interested in what I'm learning here, and you're such a fabulous teacher. Make sure that you're keeping everybody's egos, you know, polished. And then ask them, can I go to the pediatric rounds? Can I go to the ground rounds? Try to spend as much time in your free time with the pediatric residency.
Do programs prefer that you do all sub-Is, or would doing an elective in the pediatrics department be equivalent, or is sub-I preferred for them?
Sub-Is are the strongest thing that you can do. So like the letters of recommendation, the best letter of recommendation you can get is from a faculty member or a program director at a pediatric residency program. That doesn't mean that other pediatric letters of recommendations aren't good. It just means that those other ones are a little bit better. So same with audition rotations. Sub-Is are the best because sub-Is, sub-internship, you're acting like an intern. So they really get to see what your internship work is. If you can't get a sub-I, and sub-Is are exhausting. So I discourage anybody from doing more than 3 or 4 sub-Is because you're exhausted throughout them. It's like you're interviewing the entire time and you're constantly on the go. So doing elective rotations are certainly a nice way to not be on call as much and to not be in it as much, but it also means that oftentimes you're not interacting with the interns as much, you're not interacting with the residents. So sub-Is are the best. But it's perfectly acceptable to do electives. And on those electives, you should still try to meet with that program director a couple times to let them know how interested you are. And on electives, so let's say you're doing, a pediatric cardiology elective, and so you're spending some time in their outpatient clinic, you're spending some time in the hospital with the residents. Make sure that you're going to all of the rounds, the morning reports, the grand rounds, the noon conferences, all of those type of things, so you can interact with the residents during those times as well.
So what advice do you have for keeping up your energy as you're doing sub-I after sub-I?
Excellent question. I wish I had better advice. I mean, like the typical stuff, right? Like, make sure you're sleeping, make sure you eat well, make sure you keep up with your exercise. Things are like impossible to do when you're exhausted and working so much. Yeah, I don't know, just good luck. Know that there's an end in sight. You get to work with peds, and so I find working with kids, working in children's hospitals, even during my residency, we would work oftentimes more than 80 hours, which is something I'm not supposed to admit to. But even after being on call so many times, and then you come into the hospital and you're like, the last place I want to be is at work. And then you walk in and there's a kid playing, or a kid looking at the pet therapy dog. And it's like instantly energizing because kids are just so darn cute. So I guess trying to focus on other things and know that it's not forever. Know that hard work is going to pay off. Oh, there's a letter in chat. Can I read the letter in chat? So there's a letter in chat that says, if you're aiming for a letter from a program director during your sub-I, is it sufficient to meet with them once or twice during the rotation with the expectation that they'll defer to the attending and residents that you worked with? Or does asking a letter from the program director require more direct interactions with them? And I would say that it's the latter, that if you're going to ask for a letter from the program director, you need to have worked directly with them. So I still encourage you to meet with that program director a couple of times, but then if you haven't worked with that program director on the floor, then I would ask the attending that you've worked with to write that letter for you.
On a 4-week audition rotation, when would be the most appropriate time to ask for that letter of recommendation, and how much time should you be giving them to write it?
So if you are going to, oftentimes, unfortunately, on a 4-week rotation, you may work with multiple attendings. So I would say the very first time you feel like you're clicking with an attending, the first time an attending gives you a compliment, that might be a good time to let them know. I would love to get a letter at the end of this rotation from you, so that you're kind of putting it in their ear. Definitely let them know at the end of the rotation. I would love to get, would you be willing to write me a strong letter of recommendation for pediatrics? I've loved working with you. Once again, stroking people's egos. I can't tell you how important that is. So let them know how fantastic they are. And then comes the complicated game of waiting for them to actually write your letter and submit it. Don't be afraid to contact them multiple times. I try to be as quick as I can. I write tons of letters of recommendation. I try to be as quick as I can with the turnaround. So by the time they send me, the student sends me their ARAS cover sheet, I try to get it out within the next couple of days. There are times that I forget, right? There are times when things just slip down into the bottom of your email inbox. And so don't be afraid to contact them again if they haven't written you. And you can even say in your initial ask, when you're sending them the cover sheet, say, if I don't hear from you, is it okay if I remind you in a couple of weeks? And then remind them. I don't think any of us feel upset when somebody says, hey, have you gotten around to that letter? Do you remember that letter? It just feels really awkward for the student because you don't want to be harassing somebody who you know is really busy. But as somebody who is really busy and writes letters, sometimes we need the harassment.
How many days do you think you should have worked with an attending in order to ask them for a letter of recommendation? If you're only working with them for a week of a 4-week rotation, is that enough? Should you aim for more? Just a couple days, is that enough? Something like that.
It depends on you and your relationship with the attending. I would say a week is certainly enough to write a letter, especially in an inpatient rotation where you're taking care of a lot of patients. 2 days is a little bit trickier. Like ideally you've had enough time for them to see your improvement, right? Even one day they'll be able to see your enthusiasm, they'll be able to see how hard you work, but they won't be able to see how consistent you are over time or what improvements you make over time. If you, if you're in one of those rotations where so especially the ICU rotations, sometimes you won't get to work with attendings very directly, and maybe, attendings will kind of pop in and pop out. Like I said, anytime you feel like there's that connection with an attending seems to be taking the shine to you, I would ask them, and if they're not comfortable, then that's fine.
Since absences tend to be pretty tricky with sub-Is, would you recommend against scheduling them during the interview months?
No, I would still recommend. I mean, that's like peak season. I'm going to share my desktop with you guys again, so I can show you this. So I guess maybe there was more on here that we could have looked at. So here, so this is for pediatrics. And this is the percentage of that program. So this is when they offered the interview, October, November, December. I will say this last year, I feel like our students didn't really get interview offers until fairly late. Many more of them were in this November, December timeframe. So if you're waiting for interview offers, don't freak out if it's gotten all the way to November and you haven't heard a lot yet. That doesn't mean that you're out of luck. But this is directly related to the most recent question, is when are interviews conducted? And you can see that the majority of the interviews are conducted November, December, January. The peak times for you to be doing audition rotations and sub-Is are August, September, October, November, maybe December. So we're cutting into a couple of those. If you are doing an audition rotation or a sub-I during October, November, December, programs know that that's interview season, right? Some programs are super strict and they say you can only have one day of absence while you're here with us. But the vast majority of programs understand that it's interview season. So as long as you let them know as early as possible, I'm going to need to be away on these particular days for interviews. How can I make it up? Can I do an extra call day? Can I come in on the weekend? Make sure you're offering to make up time for it. But it feels like it would be a big waste if you didn't schedule audition rotations or sub-Is during October, November, or December. That would be very unfortunate.
So with the COMLEX Level 2 score release dates, how much of a difference does it make if your score is released after that September 15th day when ERES opens? Say if your score is released on September 20th, would that be too much of a difference?
That would be fine. as long as they can have your scores, and especially if you didn't do great on level 1 and you really want to show that you have that improvement, or if you do really well on level 2 and you want them to take that into account, as long as they have that score by the time that they're deciding whether or not to interview you. So, you know, as long as they have it by October or so, then that should be fine.
All right, it's about 8:30 now, Dr. Hendricks. It doesn't look like we have any other questions. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's early there for you, but we really appreciate the session. I think it's really been helpful. I think you guys would agree. Thank you, Dr. Hendricks.
Thank you,
We'll
guys.
see you later today for your second session.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. And I have recorded this session up on the cloud, and so we'll take a look and see what it looks like. But if it looks good, then maybe we can offer it to all of our student members to watch in their leisure.
Okay. That's a great idea. Thank you, Dr. Hendricks.
All right. Thank you guys so much.
Bye.
Bye.